The bell above Whitaker's Antiques jingled softly every time someone entered, but Jeremiah never made it ring. Instead, he stood outside. Every Saturday morning, no matter the weather, the boy would appear. Skin the color of roasted chestnuts, coat 2 sizes too big, curls pressed under a wool hat. He'd stand with his nose inches from the wide display window, hands behind his back like a museum visitor. He stared not at the price tags or gold frames, but at a single item, a delicate wooden music box resting on a velvet cloth near the window's center. Mr. Whitaker noticed the boy within the first week he opened the store on Maple and 12th. At first, he ignored him, just another child with more curiosity than coin. But the boy kept coming back. Every Saturday. Every time. Silent. On the 3rd Saturday, Whitaker raised a brow behind the counter and muttered, "The glass must be cleaner than I thought." He stepped outside with a rag and a mild grumble, "Don't smudge it." The boy startled, stepping back. "I wasn't touching," Jeremiah whispered. "Good. That box ain't for sale anyway." That might have ended the conversation, but the boy nodded solemnly as if he already knew. "I just like how it waits," Jeremiah said. Whitaker blinked. "How what waits?" "The box. It looks like it's waiting for someone to open it, but it ain't sad, just patient." It was the oddest thing anyone had ever said about an object in his shop. And somehow it stuck. Later that day, as the sun slanted through the windows, Mr. Whitaker watched Jeremiah stoop outside and begin picking up trash near the curb. He moved quietly, collected wrappers and stray leaves into a grocery bag, then arranged the welcome map that had curled up at the corners. No one asked him to. No one thanked him. He did it anyway. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Jeremiah never came inside. He never begged or lingered when Whitaker locked up, just helped quietly, then walked down the street where the sidewalk cracked and the buildings leaned tiredly to one side. It took until early December for Whitaker to open the door and say, "You know it's warm inside, right?" The boy looked up, hesitant. "Can I?" Whitaker nodded once. "You tracking in mud, I'll toss you right back out." Inside, Jeremiah moved like a whisper, eyes wide, fingers at his sides. He didn't reach for anything. Instead, he walked straight to the box. It was carved from cherry wood, edges worn smooth by time. A golden treble clef was etched on top, and beneath it a tiny keyhole. Whitaker had never figured out how to wind it or why it wouldn't play. "That box belonged to my son," the old man said quietly. "He bought it for his daughter before the accident." Jeremiah looked up. "I'm sorry." "He never got to give it to her." They stood in silence. Then Jeremiah asked, "May I sing to it?" Whitaker chuckled. "Sing to it?" "Sometimes music don't come from the box. Sometimes it just needs to remember what it sounds like." Whitaker's mouth opened, then closed. Curiosity edged out skepticism. "Well, go ahead." The boy knelt before the music box. Then, in a voice soft as snowfall, he began to hum. It wasn't a song Whitaker recognized. It wasn't polished or proper or trained, but it was true, pure. It held the ache of old buildings and the hope of cracked sidewalks. It sounded like morning bread and hands calloused by kindness. It sounded like something the world forgot. And then, click. The lid of the music box trembled and opened, just slightly. Whitaker stared. "What an—" Jeremiah stood up slowly. "I didn't touch it." The music box released a single haunting note, then fell silent again. Whitaker stepped forward, heart racing, eyes narrowed. He reached to touch it, but the box didn't move for him. "I didn't know it could open," he whispered. Jeremiah didn't reply. His eyes had already shifted back to the window. "I should go." Whitaker asked. "Will you come back next week?" Jeremiah smiled. "I never left." Then he was gone. That night, Whitaker sat alone in the shop. The heater hummed, the snow tapped against the window. He stared at the music box. It hadn't opened in years, not once. And now it had responded not to hands or tools or keys, but to a song. To a boy with nothing in his pockets, but everything in his voice. And so began a season neither of them would forget. A season where wounds hummed into healing, and a gift long forgotten slowly learned how to sing again. The next Saturday, Jeremiah didn't come. Mr. Whitaker noticed the absence before he admitted it to himself. He told himself he wasn't looking, that he hadn't glanced at the window every few minutes, that the little velvet cloth where the music box sat didn't look lonelier without that small face watching it from the other side of the glass. The bell above the door didn't ring. But when Whitaker stepped outside to sweep the stoop, something caught his eye. Folded neatly and wedged beneath the welcome mat was a sheet of notebook paper. It had been weighed down with a smooth, round stone. His name was printed across the front in careful block letters, Mr. Whitaker. He opened it slowly. "Dear Mr. Whitaker, thank you for letting me come inside, and thank you for letting me sing. I didn't know the box would open. That was special. Sometimes I write songs. I don't know all the notes, but I know how they feel. I think the box felt something too. I can't come this week. My mom says we have to go somewhere for a bit, but I'll be back soon, I promise. Please keep singing to the box. Even if it stays quiet, it's still listening. Yours truly, Jeremiah. P.S. If you ever hear it sing on its own, write it down. That means it remembered." Whitaker read the letter twice, then a third time. He folded it back along its original creases, as if to preserve its quiet magic. For a moment, he stood still, letting the December wind press against his coat, letting the sidewalk go quiet around him. Inside, he placed the letter in the back of the ledger book where he once recorded sales, a book now mostly filled with dust and canceled invoices. He looked at the music box. It hadn't moved since that day, but it looked aware. That evening, he pulled an old chair beside the front window. Customers had stopped coming in around 5, and the streetlights buzzed with amber glow. He placed the box on the chair's armrest. And then, after a long silence, Whitaker did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He sang. Not like Jeremiah. His voice cracked on the low notes, wavered on the highs. But he remembered a lullaby his wife once sang to their son, a tune carried by kitchen light and warm milk and the creak of wooden floors. "Hush now, little river, don't you cry." It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The box didn't open, but it shimmered in the light, as if it heard him, as if it remembered. The next morning he found another note, this one tucked in the corner of the window pane, nearly hidden under a flyer for a church bake sale. The handwriting was the same, but the paper was thinner, torn from a grocery bag. "Dear Mr. Whitaker, we had to leave faster than I thought. I saw you through the window last night. You were singing. I smiled so big my mama told me to hush. That song was beautiful. The box liked it. I know. I could feel it. Don't worry. I'll be back when it's time. Some things come late, but they still come true. Yours truly, Jeremiah." Mr. Whitaker wiped his eyes with the corner of the sleeve he'd pretended wasn't patched. Then he taped the new letter next to the first one on the wall behind the counter. He looked out the window again. Jeremiah was gone. But his words stayed. His music lingered. And something inside the old man, Something dulled by time and grief and silence began to stir. Not fully, not yet, but like the music box, it was waiting. Winter deepened, but the shop stayed open. Mr. Whitaker kept the open sign lit longer than usual, though few people came in. Still, every morning he unlocked the door, wound the grandfather clock, and lit the small lamp in the front window, next to the music box. Jeremiah hadn't returned, but the shop somehow felt fuller, as if his presence had rewound something inside its walls. Then, one Tuesday, in the thick hush of mid-afternoon, the bell above the door jingled. It wasn't the cheerful jingle he was used to. It was sharp, like a sudden knock on memory. In stepped a man wrapped in a dark wool coat, tall and thin, with a face that looked like it had been folded and unfolded too many times. Tired, lined, but alert. His eyes scanned the room quickly, as if he was memorizing everything before it disappeared. "Afternoon," he said. Whitaker nodded, cautious. "Welcome. Looking for something specific?" The man gave a half-smile. "Not really. Just browsing what remains." His voice was rough, not unkind. He walked slowly around the shop, stopping now and then, not to pick things up, but just to look. A photo frame, a cracked lamp, an old brass compass missing its needle. Then he paused at the music box. He didn't touch it, just stood there, staring. Whitaker came closer. "Most folks pass that one by. It doesn't open." The man didn't answer. After a moment he said, "It was never about the opening." That stopped Whitaker. "Come again?" The man finally turned. His eyes, gray like riverstone, looked straight into Whitaker's. "It's about the waiting." They sat across from each other soon after, 2 mugs of tea warming their hands. "You used to come in here, years ago, didn't you?" The man chuckled, nodding. "Once or twice, when I was a boy." "And now?" He tapped the table lightly. "Now I return because the world outside doesn't remember how to pause." Whitaker leaned forward. "And you do?" The man smiled again, smaller this time, almost sad. "I try." They didn't speak for a while, the kind of silence that has weight, not awkwardness, presence. Then Whitaker asked, "You got a name?" The man looked toward the window. "People used to call me Lenny." "Just Lenny?" Lenny was enough. They spoke in fits and starts over the next hour. Lenny never explained exactly where he came from, but his words hinted at long distances, physically, emotionally. A brother he no longer spoke to, a piano he used to play in a chapel that no longer stood, a son he hadn't met. When Whitaker asked why he'd come in today, Lenny hesitated. Then he said, "I was walking by, and I felt something call me." "Call you?" He nodded toward the music box. "It doesn't open," Whitaker repeated. Lenny smiled faintly. "It doesn't need to." Before he left, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the counter. "For the boy." Whitaker frowned. "What boy?" "The one who's waiting," Lenny said. Then he turned and left. After the door shut, Whitaker carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a tiny silver key, worn, bent slightly at the tip, but unmistakably a music box key. He stared at it for a long time, then looked at the music box. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." But part of him, some old dusty part that hadn't believed in much for years, wondered. Could this be the key?
Could Jeremiah have somehow started something? Could Lenny have heard what Whitaker had only imagined? He tried the key. It didn't fit. Not quite. It slid in just a little, but didn't turn. Whitaker didn't force it. He set it down gently on the cloth and placed both beside the box. And then he did what Jeremiah had asked. He sang. The box stayed closed. But afterward, as the light dimmed behind the curtains and Whitaker sat quietly, sipping the rest of his tea, he thought he heard something. A note. No, a memory of a note, like a whisper through wood. He smiled. Sometimes keys don't open locks. Sometimes they open people.
It began the following morning. When Mr. Whitaker arrived at the shop just before sunrise, brushing snow off his shoulders and fiddling with the stubborn lock on the front door, he noticed something taped to the inside of the window. A piece of paper, lined, carefully torn from a notebook. On it, a child's handwriting in pencil. Why doesn't the box open? He looked around. The street was empty. No footprints, no sign of a child. He pulled the note down, puzzled, and stepped inside. The air was still, scented with old wood and tea. He walked to the counter and read the note again. No name, no signature, just the question. He left it beside the music box and went about his morning routine. But the next day, there was another note. This one said, "Do you think it ever played a lullaby?" And the next day, if it could talk, what would it say? Mr. Whitaker began pinning the notes to the wall above the box. He didn't know who was leaving them. He never saw anyone, but he found himself anticipating them, looking forward to the wondering of this mystery child who clearly felt the music box held something sacred. One evening, just after locking up, he stood before the wall of notes, 10 by then. Some were questions. Some were drawings. One of a child with a giant ear leaning toward the box, as if listening to a story. One simply read, "Sometimes I feel like that box." Whitaker sat down slowly. That one he understood more than he wished to admit. The next morning he left his own note. He taped it gently to the inside of the glass. It said, "Maybe it's not about opening. Maybe it's about listening." He felt silly, like he was having a conversation with a ghost or a whisper or a forgotten corner of his own past. But the next day, a reply. "I try to listen, but it's so loud everywhere." He smiled sadly. He taped up a reply beneath it. "Try here. It's quiet in here." A week passed like that, back and forth, letter by letter. Sometimes words, sometimes drawings, sometimes just shapes. The child, whoever they were, had begun to sign their notes with a tiny drawing, a star with eyes. So Whitaker began signing his with a small violin. And just like that, a conversation bloomed in silence. One snowy Thursday, a note appeared that stopped him cold. It said, "I showed it to my brother. He said music boxes are stupid, but I think they remember things we forget." Whitaker held the note to his chest. He didn't know this child, had never seen them, but he knew that feeling of believing in something others found foolish. He whispered to the empty shop, "You're not wrong." That night, he dusted the music box more gently than usual, polished the glass over its face, adjusted the light in the window so it fell just right, as if making it ready for something. The next morning, no note came, nor the next. 3 days, then 5, then a week.
Whitaker still left his own notes, but none were answered. He worried. Had something happened? Had the child moved? Had the world outside finally shouted too loudly? He didn't know. But he kept writing, every day. Until 2 weeks later, he came to open the shop and found a folded letter, not a note, but a real letter, wedged beneath the door. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a drawing. A child, a man, sitting on either side of a music box. Their eyes were closed, but they were smiling. Underneath, written in careful pencil, were the words, "Thank you for keeping the quiet safe." Mr. Whitaker turned to the box. He didn't try the key. He just sat down beside it and listened.
The bell above the door chimed one crisp afternoon as a man stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of leather, oil, and the ticking silence of long work. He wore a brown coat, the cuffs slightly frayed, and wire-framed glasses that magnified his eyes. In his hands, he carried a small velvet pouch. Whitaker looked up from his stool behind the counter. The man smiled gently. You must be the one with the music box in the window." Whitaker nodded. "I suppose I am." "I'm Henry Lowen," the man said, setting the pouch on the counter. "I used to repair time, watches, clocks. Now I just watch." Whitaker offered a soft chuckle. "And what brings you here, Mr. Lowen?" Henry untied the pouch and slowly unwrapped its contents. A cracked watch face, its gears exposed and trembling as if still remembering movement. "I heard about your shop," he said, "and I've been walking past it for weeks. Something told me you might understand what this is." Whitaker examined the broken watch. Not particularly rare, not especially ornate, but something about it, perhaps the way the hands were frozen just before midnight, made him pause. "May I ask what happened to it?" Henry hesitated. "It belonged to my wife," he said at last. "She died last winter, and this was the last thing she wound before time stopped for both of us." Whitaker didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, fingers tracing the cracked glass. Henry continued, "I tried to fix it, but some things aren't meant to be restarted. They're meant to be remembered." He looked up. "I heard you have a box that doesn't open. That maybe it wasn't meant to. That maybe it listens?" Whitaker's brow rose slightly. "I don't know who told you that, but they're not wrong." Henry smiled, and for a moment the tiredness in his eyes cleared. "I was hoping," he said carefully, "that maybe the box could keep something else that doesn't tick anymore, but meant everything once." Whitaker understood. Not entirely, but enough. That evening, as the street grew quiet and the sky turned the color of tea, Whitaker stood before the window with the music box and the notes still pinned above it. He opened the small drawer at the base of the box. It was the only part that opened, a tiny compartment lined with blue felt, like a whisper waiting to hold something. Carefully, reverently, he placed the broken watch inside, closed the drawer, and let it rest. The next morning, another note appeared on the window. This one wasn't in a child's hand. It was small, neat, and read, "Thank you for giving memory a home. H.L." Whitaker added it to the wall, right beside the child's drawing of the man and the music box. The wall was growing now, not just a space for curiosity, but for connection, for those with things that no longer worked, but still mattered. A violin string snapped and wore, a locket with no photo, a thimble passed down 5 generations. People started bringing them.
No explanations, no fuss. Just quiet offerings. Pieces of soundless stories. And Whitaker kept them. Not to sell, but to remember. One day someone asked, "Is this still an antique shop?" Whitaker smiled. "No," he said softly, "not exactly." "It's a museum?" He shook his head. "A listening place." They tilted their head. What?" He pointed to the music box, to the wall of notes, to the drawer holding the broken watch. "It's where things go when the world forgets how to hear them."
The first time Whitaker noticed the boy, it was a rainy Thursday afternoon, and the shop had been empty for hours. He was standing across the street, under the narrow eave of the laundromat, clutching something in both hands. His shoes were soaked, his hood too thin, and he didn't blink much, just stared at the window display like he'd lost something in it. Whitaker watched for a moment before stepping outside, rain slicking his shoulders. "Looking for something?" he asked gently. The boy's eyes flicked up, pale brown, wide, the kind that had already learned too much and still wanted to believe. He didn't answer, just shook his head. Whitaker hesitated, then stepped aside. "You can come in if you'd like. It's warmer." The boy didn't move for a long beat. Then slowly he crossed the street, dripping and quiet, and entered the shop. Inside, he uncurled his fingers. In his hands were birds. Not real ones, delicately folded cranes made from yellowing notebook paper, old receipts, even a torn corner of a cereal box. Some of them were smeared with ink. Others carried faint words: Monday, lunch, PB&J, call mom. Whitaker offered a towel, which the boy ignored. "They're birds?" he asked, crouching down. The boy nodded, then pointed to the highest shelf behind the music box window, a quiet request. Whitaker picked one of the cleaner cranes. "Want me to put one up there?" The boy nodded again, just once. So he did. Carefully balancing the paper bird on a brass candlestick beside the broken music box. The boy watched the entire time, rainwater pooling beneath him. When Whitaker looked back down, the boy was gone. It became a pattern. Every few days, a new bird would appear, tucked between the shutters, slipped through the mail slot, once even left on Whitaker's stoop with a piece of gum as a weight. Each bird was different, sometimes misshapen, sometimes perfect, but always folded with care. And always carrying fragments of a life, a spelling quiz, a grocery list, a note reading, "Don't forget me today." Whitaker didn't know where the boy lived or what his name was, but he kept every bird. He cleared a shelf just for them, called it the aviary. Then, one Saturday morning, a knock came at the back door. Whitaker, apron still on, opened it to find the boy standing there, only this time not alone. A woman stood beside him, mid-30s, tired, wearing a nurse's badge, and the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from just one bad night. "I'm sorry," she said, eyes darting around. "He said he came here. Said you were keeping his birds." Whitaker nodded. The boy reached into his coat and handed Whitaker the newest crane. This one was folded from sheet music, a lullaby. Whitaker turned it over. On the wing, in careful child's handwriting, were 4 words: "For when she forgets." The mother saw it. Her breath hitched, and then she knelt down, wrapping the boy in a trembling hug. "I won't," she whispered. "I promise I won't forget." But her eyes were wet, and Whitaker knew. That night, Whitaker stayed late in the shop, sorting the cranes one by one, building a mobile of string and wire. By morning, they spun slowly from the ceiling above the music box, catching light and memory in equal measure. People came to see them, left their own birds. A teenager brought a folded letter from her father in prison. An elderly woman brought a crane made from her wedding vows. A child brought one scribbled with their first sentence, "I love you." And the boy? He kept coming. Sometimes with more birds, sometimes just to sit and watch them fly in place. One day, he finally spoke. "My name's Ezra." Whitaker smiled. "That's a strong name." Ezra looked up at the birds. "They remember for me." Whitaker nodded. "That's what they do." And when someone asked him later that week what the birds were for, Whitaker simply said, "They're prayers that never needed words."
It arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper and tied with what looked like the string from a bakery box. Whitaker found it resting neatly on the counter after he'd returned from lunch. No note, no name, just a small square parcel, warm from the sun, left like a secret waiting to be discovered. He untied the string. Inside was a mirror. Old, oval, its frame chipped and ornate. Silver leaf peeling at the corners. And tucked behind the glass, between backing and wood, was a photograph. A black and white print, creased at the fold. He slid it out. It showed two people, a young man with dark curls and a crooked smile, leaning against the shoulder of a tall woman in a military uniform. They were laughing, really laughing, eyes crinkled, caught in a moment of unscripted joy. There was something in their faces Whitaker recognized, not the features themselves, but the feeling. He turned the mirror over again. On the back, scrawled in pencil, "Return this only if she remembers me. Otherwise, let her keep smiling." The next morning, the woman came. She walked in like someone searching for something she wasn't sure she'd recognize. Hair pinned back in careful coils, heels clicking too sharply on the old floor. She stopped in front of the mirror display. Whitaker watched from behind the workbench, not saying a word. The woman leaned closer to the old mirror, not to fix her hair, not to admire, just staring. Her fingers trembled near the frame, but didn't touch it. Then she noticed the photograph. She picked it up and froze. Whitaker walked over slowly, cautious not to break the moment. "That belonged to someone?" she asked, voice brittle. Whitaker nodded. It was left for someone who might remember or not. She blinked. "I was 19, she whispered. "We were at the train station. He was heading west. I told him I'd write. I never did." She sat on the small bench by the window, the photo still in her hands. "I buried that day. Years of noise and duty, and I forgot how to laugh like that." The mirror lay between them. "He said," Whitaker offered, "that if you remembered, I could return it to you." She looked at him, really looked, and smiled. "I don't remember everything, but I remember enough." She placed the mirror gently in her lap and held it like something fragile that might dissolve. "Does that count?" Whitaker nodded. "It counts." She came back a week later, this time with a shoebox. Inside were dozens of photographs, sepia and gray, some water-damaged, others fading from sunlight. Soldiers, dancers, a street corner bakery, a dog in a paper crown. She asked if he could display them. "If I can't carry them all in my memory, maybe your shop can help." So he did. He cleared the south wall, hung a simple sign above it. "Echoes. Faces we forgot to frame." People brought more. A teacher left her first class. A man donated a Polaroid of the day his sister got her hearing aids. A woman posted a photo of her wedding day without the groom. "This is the last moment I truly knew myself," she wrote. Soon the wall wasn't enough. The photos crept onto the beams, the shelves, even the floorboards beneath the window bench. And every single one had a story. A memory reclaimed, or a truth no longer hidden. Whitaker would sometimes catch Ezra, the boy with the paper birds, sitting beneath the photographs, staring at faces not his own. "Why do they leave them here?" the boy asked one evening. "Because not every memory fits inside a person," Whitaker replied. "Some need a second home." Ezra nodded, then pulled a small picture from his coat pocket. It was faded, curled at the edges. A woman with wild hair holding a paper bird. "She tried," he whispered. "She really did." Whitaker took the photo gently and found a space for it beneath the mirror.
Every first Sunday of the month, Whitaker opened the back garden. It wasn't much of a garden, more of a patch of uneven cobblestone framed by half-wild vines, a cracked fountain, and a collection of wind chimes he never took down, even in winter. Some had been gifts, others were salvaged from demolished porches and forgotten attics. Each one had its own voice, and together they sang a melody the wind composed. He called it the Listening Court. That Sunday, he brewed tea with wild mint and sliced fresh honeycomb from a local beekeeper. He placed everything on a long wooden table, surrounded by mismatched chairs and a few stubborn tree stumps. No invitations were ever sent. People just showed up. Some came to talk. Others came to listen. But most came to remember something they didn't know they'd forgotten. That morning, just before sunrise, Whitaker stepped outside to arrange the cups. As he passed beneath the old trellis, a chime made of colored bottles clinked in a soft breeze. He paused. There was a note tied to the neck of the green bottle. "For the ones who only speak when the world is quiet." The first guest was the watchmaker. He brought a small jar of marmalade and a silent smile. He didn't say much. He rarely did. But when the chimes played a high G, his eyes filled like he'd just heard the voice of an old friend. Next came Ruth, the retired jazz pianist who wore red shoes even in the rain. She brought a spoon and tapped rhythms on the rim of her cup, as if waiting for music to answer her. Then the boy with the paper birds arrived, clutching a folded page. Whitaker knelt beside him. "What's today's message?" Ezra opened the paper slowly. It read, "Some things break because they were meant to be shared." People came and went throughout the day. Some stayed a moment, others lingered. At one point, a young woman stepped into the garden holding nothing but a cracked glass jar filled with marbles. She said nothing, placed the jar at the foot of the fountain, and left. When the wind passed through the vines, the marbles knocked gently against the glass. A new kind of chime. Whitaker didn't move it. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the stones, Whitaker brought out the honey. It glowed amber in the fading light, thick and slow. "Why honey?" Ruth asked, spreading some on a biscuit. Whitaker smiled. "Because it never spoils, just like stories." She laughed softly. "Even the ones that hurt?" "Especially those." Later, as people filtered out and the garden grew quiet, Ezra approached the fountain. He touched the marble jar, then turned to Whitaker. "What happens to the sounds when everyone's gone?" Whitaker looked around, the wind stirring leaves, a spoon resting against an empty cup, the clink of a distant chime. He said, "They wait." "For what?" "For someone to remember how to listen." Ezra tilted his head, as if trying to hear something just out of reach. "I think I do," he whispered. That night,
As Whitaker gathered the cups and folded the chairs, he paused beside the glass chimes. In the moonlight, they shimmered. A single note rang out, clear, warm, like honey melting into song.
The shop had no cash register, no scanner, no touchscreen, no receipts printed by thermal ink. Instead, tucked beneath the counter of Whitaker's store, hidden behind a stack of dusty dictionaries and a rusted tin labeled "Buttons of Uncertain Origin," was a single leather-bound ledger. Its spine was cracked, its pages brittle and yellowed. The ink varied from fountain to ballpoint to pencil to something that looked suspiciously like charcoal. He called it the Lantern Book, because every entry inside had once lit the way for someone lost. On a rainy Wednesday, when the clouds hung low and the bell above the door remained quiet, Whitaker took the book out and placed it on the counter. He opened it not to the first page, but the middle. Always the middle. There, between the entry for "One Conversation Over Broken Teacups, Bartered for Silence," and "A Bicycle Bell That Sounded Like Home," was a blank space. The paper was worn, as though someone had hovered there for years, but never found the words. He dipped his pen and paused. The door opened. Ezra stepped in, soaked from ankle to collarbone, his hair sticking in curls across his forehead. In his hand was a small wooden box with a cracked lid. Whitaker didn't ask. He simply nodded toward the stove, where a kettle hummed. Once they'd each cradled a steaming cup, Ezra placed the box on the counter. "I found it behind the baseboard in my apartment," he said. "It was hidden under some loose floorboards." Whitaker gently opened it. Inside, a pair of spectacles with one cracked lens, a key with no teeth, a receipt from 1967, stained with what looked like ink and time. A note. "If you find this, you're part of it now." Ezra looked nervous. "What does that mean?" Whitaker turned the note over. On the back, a name had been written in faint pencil, L. Harrington, and below it, "Light comes last." They pulled down the town registry, they called the library, they visited the old barber who remembered everything but names. Finally, at the local archives, a volunteer named Miss Willa whispered, "Harrington? Oh yes. He ran the lighthouse." "Lighthouse?" Ezra blinked. Willa nodded. "Out by Hollow Bay. Shut down after the fire in '72. Rumor was he died inside, but no one found a body." "Then how did the note end up in my floorboards?" She leaned closer. "Some people say Whitaker's store used to be part of his home, that the walls remember." That night, Whitaker reopened the Lantern Book. In careful script, he wrote, "Box returned. Light passed forward. The boy listens." He closed the book and walked to the back of his store, where an old brass lantern sat on a high shelf. It hadn't been lit in decades. He struck a match. The wick caught instantly, glowing soft amber, flickering as though it had been waiting. The wind outside howled, but inside, something steadied. Ezra stood beside him, the box now empty but his eyes full. As they watched the lantern burn, Whitaker said, "Not everything left behind is lost. Some things wait for the right hands." Ezra nodded slowly. "And the wrong ones? They pass it by. They're too busy looking for things that shine." He let the silence settle, before adding, "The real light comes after. Always after." From that day on, the lantern stayed in the window of the shop. Not bright, but unmistakable. And when night fell,
It didn't just illuminate the street. It reminded the forgotten that someone still remembered.
Ezra came in early. He always did now, before school, before the noise of buses and bells and rushing footsteps. The shop had become his quiet before the day. But that morning, something was different. The floor creaks the same. The kettle whistled like usual. Whitaker was perched on his stool behind the counter, sipping from his chipped blue mug. But Ezra paused halfway to the stove. There was a new shelf. It jutted slightly from the west wall, nestled between the cabinet of silent radios and the stack of unread newspapers. About shoulder height. 5 planks. Maple wood. Dustless. Ezra pointed. That wasn't there yesterday. Whitaker didn't look. No, he said, sipping. It wasn't. There were 6 objects on the shelf. A feather, heavy like metal, a thimble filled with salt, a sealed envelope addressed only to maybe, a child's drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands beside a giant sun, a chess pawn, but melted halfway down like wax, a stone with a perfect hole through the middle. Ezra leaned in. Is it a display? Whitaker shook his head. It's a collection. Of what? Memories that didn't want to be forgotten. Ezra lifted the envelope first. The paper was thick, aged, and smelled faintly of lavender. No return address, no stamp, just the single word, maybe. He held it up. Can I open it? You can, but it's not yours. Ezra set it back down, a little too fast. He moved to the drawing. The stick figures had smiling faces, and one had a cape. On the back, written in crayon, "To Daddy. Come home soon. I'm being brave." No name, no date. Ezra blinked. Someone lost this? No, said Whitaker quietly. Someone gave it away because they didn't know where else to keep it. By the time the kettle had cooled, Ezra had touched all 6 items and spoken only 5 words. This place is something else. Whitaker smiled. It doesn't belong to me, not really. It just borrows space from the world. Ezra turned to the new shelf again. But where did it come from? Whitaker reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small black notebook. Unlike the lantern book, this one was unmarked, newer, stitched with thread instead of glue. He opened it to a blank page and began writing. 10th shelf appears, 6 items, boy witnessed, feather moved. Ezra peeked. You track the shelves? Whitaker said, I don't place them, but I try to listen when they arrive. Like, the shop builds itself? No, the shop remembers. Later that afternoon, Ezra came back after school. The shelf was still there, but the envelope was gone. In its place sat a new object, a music box shaped like a rabbit. He turned to Whitaker. Did someone take it? No, he said, barely glancing up from a jigsaw puzzle. Someone needed it more than we did. Then who left the music box? Whitaker placed the last piece. A lighthouse. He said nothing, just gestured toward the shelf. Ezra stepped closer. There was a folded note underneath the rabbit. Thank you for keeping the maybe safe. She finally opened it. That night, long after Ezra had gone, Whitaker stood before the shelf with a cloth and gently wiped the planks. Underneath the bottom shelf, etched so faintly only the softest light revealed it, were 3 words. We still remember. The girl wore rain boots even when the sky was clear. They were sunflower yellow, faded, scuffed, and 2 sizes too big. Her steps echoed like puddles on a quiet street, even when the wooden floor of Whitaker's shop creaked underneath. She came in without knocking, didn't hesitate, didn't speak, just stood there, cradling a battered ukulele in her arms like a secret. Whitaker looked up from dusting the shelves. He didn't smile. Not yet. He waited, sensing the weight she carried, something unspoken, heavier than the ukulele itself. "Looking for something?" he asked gently. The girl didn't answer. She looked around instead, at the wall of clocks that never ticked, the telephone that only received calls from the past, and the shelf that hadn't been there yesterday. Then she stepped forward and said the first thing. "Do you take music?" She was no older than 12, freckles across her nose, sleeves too long for her arms. Her name, she later said, was Iris, though her voice made it sound like a name she hadn't said out loud in a while. She strummed once, softly. The sound was slightly off-key, but full of something ancient and aching. Ezra, in the corner, sorting a box of old keychains, stopped what he was doing. Whitaker lowered the feather duster. "What are you offering?" he asked gently. Iris blinked. "A song. And what would you like in return?" She looked down at her shoes, then whispered, "A memory that doesn't hurt." Whitaker nodded slowly, as if she had just said something grown up. He walked to the counter, pulled out a drawer, and from it removed a small object wrapped in a cloth of deep midnight blue. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a music sheet, not paper, but glass. Notes were etched into the surface, glowing faintly in shifting hues. "This," he said, "is a listening score. You can't read it, only play it. But if you do it right, it'll play something you've never heard and always needed to." Iris reached out, but Whitaker held up a finger. "You have to sing first." She nodded and began. It was a soft melody, almost like a lullaby, but there was defiance in it too. Notes that refused to fade, lyrics that clung to the rafters like truth. No words, just feeling. Ezra felt something tighten in his chest. He'd never heard silence respond to sound before, but this time it did. The quiet of the shop didn't vanish. It listened. When she finished, Iris let out a long breath, as if the song had taken more from her than she'd expected. Whitaker placed the listening score in her hands. It hummed beneath her fingertips. She played it that night. Outside, the wind howled. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. But in her little room above the laundromat, Iris strummed the ukulele and followed the glowing notes of the glass score. And when she finished, she wept. Not from pain, from recognition. The song had no words, but she'd heard her mother's laugh in the chords, her father's humming in the background, and her own voice, smaller, clearer, unbroken. It wasn't erasure. It was remembrance without ache. A memory that didn't sting. The next morning, the ukulele was gone. In its place on the shelf sat a sealed jar filled with sound. Yes, sound, because if you listened closely, even without opening it, you could hear the faint notes of a girl's song that had once healed a forgotten place inside her. Whitaker labeled it in tidy cursive. Iris, one song, fairly traded. Ezra smiled when he saw it. "What happens when the jar breaks?" he asked. Whitaker looked up. "It doesn't," he said. And then, after a moment, "But if it ever does, it'll find someone else
who needs to hear it. The boy came on a Tuesday, just before closing. He had a plastic grocery bag tied tight at the handles, swinging against his side like a pouch of secrets. He didn't say much, just glanced up at the crooked "open" sign, stepped in through the door, and looked around like he'd arrived on the moon. Ezra noticed him first. The kid's shoes were worn down at the heels, and his shirt had a rip near the collar, hastily stitched with green thread. But what stood out most was how carefully he walked, as if afraid the floor might not hold him. Whittaker, as usual, didn't ask why he was there. Instead, he said, "That bag looks heavy." The boy nodded. "It is. Want to show me?" He hesitated. Then slowly he untied the knot and poured the contents onto the counter, a collection of marbles, dozens of them, spilling out like a burst of forgotten galaxies. They were old, some chipped, some cloudy, but others shimmered in the afternoon light, swirls of blues, golds, and reds like frozen storms. "What are you looking for?" Whittaker asked. The boy looked up. "A way to say what I can't say," he whispered. Whittaker tilted his head. "To whom?" He paused, then answered, "To my brother. He's in a place with locks. I don't get to see him." The air grew still. Ezra stopped organizing a drawer and watched silently from the back. Whittaker leaned forward, brushing his fingers through the pile of marbles. "Did you two play with these?" The boy nodded. "Every night before bed, we made up stories for each one. The red one was a fire dragon, the clear one was a truth seeker, the blue one, that was his favorite. He called it Memory Tide." Whittaker picked up the blue marble. It gleamed faintly. "If you could say anything to him," Whittaker asked softly, "what would it be?" The boy's lips trembled. He looked down. "That I didn't mean to let go." Whittaker nodded, then walked to the back room and returned with a small, flat case made of dark wood. He opened it to reveal a velvet-lined interior with tiny indentations, each shaped to hold a single marble. "This is a message cradle. It was made by a blind toymaker in Prague. He believed marbles could carry emotions. If you put them in the cradle one by one, thinking of what you want to say, they'll remember it." The boy's eyes widened. "Will he hear it?" Whittaker smiled gently. "He won't hear it with his ears, but if he holds them close, he'll know." The boy picked up the marbles one by one and placed them into the cradle. Each time he whispered something, fragments of apology, pieces of laughter, moments they once shared. The cradle grew heavier with every marble, not in weight, but in meaning. When he finished, Whittaker snapped the lid shut. "Where do I send it?" he asked. The boy gave him the name of the facility, then paused. "Will they believe it's just marbles?" Whittaker's eyes sparkled. "They'll believe whatever story you send with it." The boy laughed without the bag, just a quiet sense that he had finally said something that mattered. Ezra watched the door close behind him. "Think it will work?" he asked. Whittaker was already sealing the package. "It already has," he said. Ezra blinked. "How?" Whittaker smiled. "Because he believes it will." Days later, a counselor at the facility opened the small package addressed to a boy in a locked wing. No one questioned the marbles. They were quiet, harmless, forgotten things. But that night, a boy with tired eyes lined up the blue one, Memory Tide, on the floor and just stared at it. then smiled. Not because it spoke words, but because it didn't need to. Because it remembered for both of them.
The first time she entered the shop, she didn't notice the bell. Not the one above the door that chimed when she walked in, but the other bell. The one on the shelf behind Whitaker's desk. It was small and brass, shaped like something off a ship's deck, mounted on a wooden base worn smooth by time. A cord of faded navy blue yarn hung from its tongue. Dust clung to the inside like it hadn't rung in years. But to her, it called. "Where did you get that bell?" she asked. Whitaker didn't look up from the old schematic he was examining. "Which one?" She pointed. "The one that looks like it still remembers the sea?" Whitaker smiled faintly. "That's the blueprint bell." Ezra perked up from the back of the room. "You've never told anyone about that one." "I wasn't sure anyone ever noticed it," Whitaker replied, then turned to the girl. "Do you build things?" She blinked. "I want to, but I'm, not there yet." Her name was Juno. She was 17, wore her curls tucked into a red scarf, and carried a backpack full of mismatched pencils and dog-eared notebooks. She had dreams that smelled of sawdust and solder, and hands calloused from working late in the community garage, designing things that wouldn't quite hold or hum yet. "What kind of blueprints?" she asked softly. "The kind you don't draw on paper, the kind you feel in your bones." He reached up and gently took the bell from its place, set it between them on the counter. It used to belong to a woman named Idella Wynne. She was an architect, but not the kind who built buildings. She helped people rebuild belief. This bell was her signal. She'd ring it every time a student crossed the line between trying and knowing. "Knowing what?" Juno asked. "That what they imagined could be real." The bell had not rung since Idella passed. But Juno kept coming back. Every Saturday, she brought sketches of bicycle-powered heaters, windmill chargers, a park bench that filtered stormwater. Some made sense, some didn't. Whitaker looked at each one like they were treasure maps. He never offered corrections, only questions. What problem does this solve? Whose hands would use it? What story will it leave behind? She started sketching differently, less like assignments, more like whispers from her future self. Then one cold afternoon, she arrived with something wrapped in cloth. "I think this one works," she said breathlessly. It was a foldable streetlight, solar-powered, durable, designed for alleys where children waited after school and streetlights often went out. Compact enough to fit in a backpack, bright enough to read under. She unwrapped it, explaining every piece. When she finished, Whitaker looked at the bell, then, gently, rang it. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of sound you felt behind your ribs, like a heartbeat echoing through a long hallway. Ezra looked up from across the room and smiled. Juno froze. "You heard it?" she whispered. Whitaker nodded. "I heard you. That's what matters." She blinked back tears. "What happens now?" He turned the bell over. Inside was a folded slip of paper, yellowed with time. He handed it to her. In delicate handwriting it read, "Ring this only for those who have drawn the future with their hands." Juno left that day with the bell in her bag, not because Whitaker gave it to her, but because she'd earned it. Later that month, she submitted her design to a local youth innovation contest. She won second place, but first in hearts. The city installed 3 of her foldable lights near public bus stops. Each bore a small engraving on the side. Blueprints belonged to the brave. JW. No one knew what JW stood for.
except 3 people inside an old dusty shop where gifts couldn't be bought, only answered.